Hi everyone, welcome to Tide Talk number 7, I think it is, here at the Tide store in Old Street. My name is George, I'm the founder of Tide. Tide, as you know, is the banking service which exists to save small businesses time and money. And I know from my own experience that one of the easiest ways to waste both time and huge amounts of money is by screwing up your growth plans, which is why I'm particularly excited that we've been able to coax Andy Young, who is about as much of a celebrity on growth topics as I think there is in Europe, to come and speak with us this evening. And he's going to talk to us about what is not called growth hacking. But it's a particular honor for me to bring Andy to the store, because Andy has a very varied history. He is particularly well known as having recently worked with 500 startups, and before that, having kind of flown around the world, actually doing lots of stuff. But I first became aware of Andy when he was a founder of GroupSpaces, which was an early social network for undergraduates. And I was just discussing with Andy earlier how there is some commonality, I suspect, among internet entrepreneurs in London. That I also did my first business as a social network for undergraduates in this country, and also inexplicably didn't turn into Mark Zuckerberg during that process. But I think I learned a few things, albeit I didn't prove very much about growth, to be honest. But that's where Andy, I think, it can take over as somebody who can tell us all where we're going wrong. So please put your hands together for Andy Young. Thank you.
Thanks, George. I'm not sure if celebrity in Europe is the new big in Japan, but I don't know, we'll go. So, 7 growth lessons from Silicon Valley and why they don't call it growth hacking. Thanks for coming, everyone. Giving a talk to an empty tube station is the saddest thing. I'm guessing. I haven't done that. This is me, just to introduce myself briefly. So I'm Andy. This is my Twitter handle, as George mentioned, as this is being filmed. If you could keep all the heckling on Twitter, that would be great. Thanks. I've been in startups my whole career, George mentioned. For the last couple of years, I've been consulting and working with various companies right from seed stage with 500 startups portfolio, across the US, Europe and Asia, right through to much later stage companies. I just came back from a 9-month project with Quantcast in San Francisco. So I've been focusing on growth for the last 2 years. Before that, I spent 2 years where I launched Stripe in the UK. Before that, I had my own startup, GroupSpaces. And way back in the day, created an app called Selective Tweets, which it turned out I was surprised in a good way that over 1 million people ended up using it to connect their Facebook and Twitter accounts. I wish I could say I planned it that way, but that definitely happened to me as opposed to anything smart that I did. So that's briefly about me. And today's topic, so growth. What is this about growth anyways? Growth is, in many ways, it's a problematic word. It's very vague. I mean, what does growth mean? It's a day to share a little bit about how in the last sort of 8 or so years, there's been this new phenomenon out, particularly driven in the West Coast, of this new discipline of growth, and in particular, the formation of growth teams. So what is a growth team, and what do they do amongst Valley companies? So what do we mean by growth? And there's making something bigger, but there's lots of things we could grow. So, typically these growth teams are working on growing our active customer or user base. In particular, it's about growing whatever drives value in the business. Often growing revenue, but not necessarily. A key point that I'll come back to later is growth teams focus on growing whatever's strategically important to us in our businesses right now. So that could be different at different stages of the company. So I want to contrast that and this phenomenon of growth teams with this phrase growth hacking, you've likely encountered. And so what the heck is this growth hacking thing? It's really interesting because over here, when I say I work on growth here in London, people say, oh, you're a growth hacker. Whereas when I was out in the Valley throughout last year, the phrase growth hacking sort of caused people to recoil. And sort of, they had a very sort of negative association with it in the main. So it's interesting. I was at a event here in London probably about 4 months ago with a whole bunch of CMOs from London tech companies. And in the panel discussion, the moderator asked the CMOs on the panel, so, what is this growth thing that happens in the US? Do you guys do growth hacking? And they didn't really have much of an answer beyond some sort of vague reference to being data-driven, and not even sure what that means. So hopefully what I'm going to try and do in the next sort of 35 minutes or so is shed a bit of light on what I've learnt from spending time with people in the Valley, in growth teams, people who work in growth, and around the place. The phrase growth hacking, it's very polarizing in my experience. So for some people, growth hacking is the best thing since sliced bread, and they definitely need a growth hacker to come and fix their business. But as I say, for other people, particularly in the Valley, have more of a negative reaction. I think a lot of that negative reaction comes from a lot of the content that's out there. If you search for growth hacking or growth hacks, you get endless listicles or blogs, the 6 best growth hacks to get customers without having to pay, or an epic list of 100 growth hacks for startups. People in the Valley, their reaction is sort of kind of akin to sort of my reaction here. So I want to put this to one side and not get caught up on labels of like what's growth hacking, what's growth, and just say, let's talk about just something real. So let's talk about companies I think we've all heard of: Facebook, Airbnb, Twitter, LinkedIn, Dropbox. And if we look at the rise of these companies, who've all reached super scale, call it growth hacking, technical marketing, call it what you want. Teams at these companies are scaling to millions of users without use of traditional mass advertising or marketing techniques that would have been used to take a product to market, traditionally in years gone by. So, Facebook didn't become Facebook through TV advertising or massive brand advertising, etc. So, I wanted to dive into some examples of how some of these companies have grown. Now, these are pretty common examples. You may have encountered these examples before, but as we go through these 3 examples, I thought it'd be useful to focus in on what makes them particularly interesting and what makes them particularly relevant about how these companies have grown. So the first one, an example of engineering-driven growth. So you may have encountered this example, this story of how in the early days of Airbnb, they built out a lot of their user base off the back of Craigslist. So what they did was, Airbnb, in the beginnings, when they were just getting their first few users, they noticed that a lot of their potential customer base they wanted to reach, particularly on the demand side, so the people looking for places to stay, a lot of those people looking for a place to stay were going on Craigslist to solve that problem and were browsing listings on Craigslist for where they could stay. So the engineers at Airbnb, not the marketers, but some of the engineers, realized that they could build some functionality that would allow people who were placing their listings on Airbnb to, with one click, automatically post that listing onto Craigslist. And then people who'd gone onto Craigslist to find a place to stay would find that listing and then click through to Airbnb and become a customer of Airbnb. So a couple of things interesting about that was how Airbnb, one, identified that Craigslist was an existing platform that already had the users and the customers that they wanted to reach, and was able to leverage that in order to grow their own customer base. But the other point being that this didn't come from traditional marketing. This was actually a piece of functionality that a marketer couldn't have realized that it was possible to build this feature. It was actually an engineer who did that. The next example, another common example you've probably encountered, is Dropbox. And this is an example of product-driven growth, where Dropbox acquired many of their users through a referral scheme. So as the Dropbox story, as they've shared it, in the beginning, they started out trying to get customers for Dropbox, just like many of us may start, and they were actually running Google ads, right? And so they had ads on Google for like whatever search term, and it was costing them north of $100 to acquire a user for Dropbox, and so it was quite expensive. And that meant that it was limiting the rate at which they could grow. And so they experimented with various things, and at one point, they figured out that by getting their people who were already using Dropbox to refer their friends to become users, they could acquire users essentially for free. But the interesting part about that is they didn't just add a button into the product saying, oh, by the way, invite your friends. the way this referral scheme works is inherently linked into how people use Dropbox as a product. So if you think about it, you sign up for Dropbox, you have a free account, and you start using it, and eventually you'll come close to or hit your limit on how much free space you have, at which point, in order to continue using Dropbox, you need more space. So the referral scheme was actually built into that natural flow that people started using Dropbox, became comfortable with it, knew that they liked it, and then as part of using the product, they wanted more space, and Dropbox incentivized their users to say, if you refer your friends, then we'll give you more free space. And so, again, to recap, the difference here between just adding on a referral scheme, because you could add a referral scheme to any product or service from any company. The interesting key point about this example is how it was integrated into the product itself. So again, it wasn't a separate marketing initiative. Then a third example, viral growth. So going years and years back, there's been many examples since, but you may have heard this story about in the early days of Hotmail, they had the idea to put this kooky phrase automatically into the footer of every email sent from Hotmail. So anytime someone received an email from a Hotmail account, in the footer there was this message, P.S. I love you, get your free email at Hotmail, which caused a lot of awareness purely via the spread of every time someone used Hotmail, their contacts, their friends, their colleagues would find out about it. This was actually there was a similar story for my app Selective Tweets, the thing I mentioned at the beginning that I wish I could say I'd planned, because the way Selective Tweets works is that you could send a tweet out onto Twitter, and if you included the hashtag #FB, it would automatically, the app would monitor your Twitter account and post it across onto your Facebook page. Now, honestly, I only ever told 6 people sitting around a table in a pub that I made this app, because I made it to scratch an itch when in the pub the week before, a friend had been complaining about how everyone put all of their tweets on Facebook. This was 8 years ago, and it was polluting everything. So I honestly told 6 people, and it grew to over 1 million users through every time someone used it. There are other people following on Twitter would see that hashtag and say, what is that? And they would have a conversation with them and ask them about it. So this example of viral spread, again, an example of something that's built into the product. So pulling these together and thinking about the common themes around all of these companies that have grown, there's a couple of them. So if we're going back to that point around how these companies have grown in ways that are different from more traditional advertising or marketing routes, it's 2 things. One, that companies using modern data-driven online marketing channels, performance marketing channels like Google AdWords or Facebook ads, etc., where the difference is that we can determine exactly on an individual user basis what's working and what's not, and we can measure it, and if it works, we can double down and scale it up. And the second one is, as we've seen with many of these examples, new growth channels that are actually embedded within the product. So our definition of how we acquire customers, how we market, gets a lot wider than just perhaps you might expect from a traditional marketing team. There's a quote I really like from Casey Winters, who worked on growth at Pinterest. He said, the best startups grow super fast, not because of traditional marketing or online marketing, but because they tune the product to drive growth. So if we take it back to what growth teams are being formed to do in the Valley, they've been formed to grow companies, grow user bases, grow customer bases, but via the intersection of these 3 disciplines of product, marketing, and engineering. And one of the big differences here is traditionally marketing organizations maybe wouldn't have had a say into the product roadmap or what the engineers do. And so there'd have been that big separation traditionally. So these sort of growth teams popularized in the Valley are bringing together these cross-functional teams to say, what can we do through a mixture of marketing, product, and engineering in order to grow our businesses and grow our companies? So from here, the growth toolbox used by these teams is very cross-functional, and it encompasses all sorts of disciplines from across marketing and products and engineering: SEO, content marketing, the performance marketing, split testing, conversion optimization, user testing and user experience, viral loops, even things like getting strategic around pricing, and so on and so forth. So each of these are their own discipline in their own right. They stand alone. People can specialize in each of these. The idea of getting a growth team together is to make use of all of these tactics and more. Now, linking it back to what growth is not, and this is, I think, where a lot of people feel uneasy or dislike the term growth hacking, even though it is very prevalent, is that growth is not about finding that one silver bullet, that if I only do this one thing, then suddenly all of my problems will be solved. In particular, there are loads of tips and hacks out there, and a lot of them are very useful. I actually recommend that you subscribe to the Distro Snack newsletter that's curated every day, a growth hack tip and a GIF by my old colleague at 500, Susan Su. There's a lot of good inspirational or creative food for thought in there. But the key point is that all these little cool tips and hacks, if you just follow those by themselves, that won't in itself bring success. So when we're trying to think about how can we scale our businesses and grow our user bases and build value, there's more to it than that. So when growth teams are thinking about things that will make a difference, this is a lot of what I've learned over the past sort of 2-3 years, and then drawing off my own startup experience before, and it leads into a lot of what we've worked on during my time at 500 Startups. Encouraging people, and I'd encourage you to think about how to make a big impact. So if I split this by top of funnel, how to make a big impact, it's how to reach huge new audiences in a cost-effective way, right? Is that through new channels, like new channels arise, like Snapchat, for example, over the past few years. Every channel was new once, and the companies that were first to Facebook or the first to Google ads found them very cost-effective in the beginning when it was greenfield. Down the middle of the funnel, attracting and drawing people deeper into engaging with us, right? How to get people to understand our messaging, how to convert more, how to get people to, what people term the wow moment, so they really understand what we have to offer. And then towards the bottom of the funnel, close to the money, how to it's about conversion rates, how we can convert a higher percentage of people. And so with a growth mindset, we're thinking about a mixture of like marketing, products, user experience, all rolled into one. So growth truths and how the growth teams think about like what people who often reject the term growth hacking, sometimes use the term growth marketing, is it's all about the search for growth that is these things. It's measurable, so that we know which of our efforts are causing what user acquisition and which growth. It's predictable so that we can model it out and so that we can plan and ensure that we're having a plan that then leads into this repeatable and scalable growth. So it's not one-off tactics like PR stunts or whatever that may get us a bunch of exposure, but what can we do that we can repeat, and then if we find it works, we can double down and invest more in it and scale up that technique. And one of the big common themes within growth teams is this real focus on how important it is that growth is centered around, rather than the hacks and finding that latest listicle with the latest trick or hack that someone's found, but instead focusing on growth as a mindset and as a process that people go through to essentially find the growth that it's not the hack that happens to work for another different unrelated company out there on the internet with a different audience selling a different product to a different market, but how can we apply a mindset and a process to find what's going to work for our businesses? So I hope so far that's given a bit of context and a bit of overview to some examples of this new ways that companies have been growing, and some context around if you hear people talking about growth or growth hacking, the things that they might be referring to. So for the rest of the talk, what I've got to share is these 7 growth lessons, or very specific things to think about that I hope you can apply to your own businesses. So, diving right in with number 1. It's super basic, but nailing down your value proposition and messaging. It's amazing how many companies I work with at 500 Startups where they were quite established, raised maybe 1 or 2 rounds of funding, the product is out there, they have users. You'd kind of assume that this step would have been taken care of. And of course it's super critical to know, what are you offering? how do you talk about that to your customers? Because this is critical for in marketing, our advertising messages, in the taglines of our Google AdWords, in the messages of our display ads, etc., in our email marketing and our content marketing. And then the messaging once people land on our landing pages or the App Store and start reading about our products, even down to the messaging within the product. So it's super critical that we're getting the right messages out there. So if we think back to that, top of funnel, middle of funnel, we're converting and encouraging people to stick around and check our product out. However, it turns out, as I mentioned, the experience with 500, that when you actually stop to pause and try and answer specific questions about your value prop and your messaging, most, if not all, teams end up struggling with that. So I'll share with you what I call this 10,000 foot view exercise that I used to use at 500 startups, which essentially is very simple. It's just sitting down and quickly addressing these very basic questions. And as I say, even if you're very established at this point. So what products or service are you offering and for which target market, right? In a very succinct, can you answer that in a sentence or two? I love these next two questions. Why do our customers love us? Why do they choose us over the competition, right? And you'll probably start having an answer to that, but not why do you think this is, but direct quotes from people. What have your existing customers told you? Because people always tend to rush into, why I think my product is great. Believe me, I've been there. But every time we've done this with teams that I've worked with and we get the real feedback from customers, it's often revelationary. So how do we make money? That's pretty straightforward. It's good to have in there. What's our primary way to get new customers? This is really interesting because thinking of the focus on primary way, because most startups end up exploring with a variety of different ways to reach people. And typically, as Peter Thiel said in his book 0 to 1, if you've encountered that most startups that succeed only actually get one channel to really work for them in acquiring customers. And in fact, most startups get 0 channels to work, which is goes a long way to why most companies don't take off. So what's our primary way? And if we don't know that right now, or if we're currently acquiring customers through multiple different ways, can we stop to think which one's better? I love this next question. Our business will become a huge runaway success if what? Not to dwell on it too much now, but to get really creative. What are the conditions? Is that if the market perception of what we're doing changes? If so, what could we do to influence that through content marketing? Is that through, whatever it could be? And then finally, starting to zoom it in. So if we're working, in marketing or products, this applies across whatever discipline to get more focused around goals. So during the next 3 months, what do we want to focus on? It's probably something that we all think about. But I like really drilling it down to what one target do we want to hit? And I would sort of prompt you to ask the question, if you achieved just one thing in the next month, right? Just one thing succeeded. But if that one thing was sufficient, that you would consider that a successful month, right? What would that one thing be? So that's a super critical place to start before we even get going into working on all our tactics. So the point number 2, which I'm very conscious of, amongst earlier stage companies, is to make sure that we have product market fit before we try and grow. So what do we mean by product market fit? Very simply, first of all, that we validated there's an actual problem out there, that we're solving a real problem. 2, that we've built a product that solves that problem for people. And 3, that there's a sufficiently large market out there of people for which our products will solve a problem that they have. And the key part of why this relates to growth is because any efforts we try and do in growing or scaling our companies before we've got product market fit are going to be incredibly wasteful. The idea is if we keep throwing advertising at something that just isn't working, right? Polishing a turd, if you will, or whatever, it's not going to work and our efforts are going to be wasted. There's this concept people sometimes use of the leaky bucket, where when you first start out, any traffic, visitors, potential customers you're pouring in the top are going to fall out of all the holes in your funnel, in the wrong messaging, in a bad, the wrong feature set, whatever it may be. So this framework, growth teams find really useful for thinking about the difference between early stage versus when it's time to focus on growth stage. So early stage, the goal is product market fit. The metric we're looking at is typically around engagement, like how people are engaging with our products. Are they using the features successfully to solve their problems? The primary data we're looking at to measure that is likely qualitative. You know, it's not numbers, it's individual quotes, pieces of feedback. And our growth strategy is what some people might term hustle, right? We're not trying to scale up AdWords, we're not trying to, you know, do scaled marketing campaigns. We're trying to be out there speaking to people, like dragging them in, doing a lot of work. Maybe we're concierging the experience to help people get set up. We're doing whatever it takes. You know, that sort of cliche phrase, do things that don't scale. Right? And that's okay in the beginning because our goal is just to find, do we have that right combination of a valid problem, a product that solves that for a big enough market that makes us feel we have product market fit. Once we have that and we move on to growth stage, this is where the focus of a growth team comes in, because the goal switches to this idea of critically scalable, repeatable, predictable growth. And the metric we're focusing on is the rate at which we're growing. The data we're looking at, now we're into the numbers, the quantitative stuff. You know, it's like how many people are transacting on our marketplace or e-commerce site. How many new subscribers are we adding? You know, what is, you know, if we have a subscription business, what is our growth in the real metric of value of our business? So avoiding the vanity metrics. Definition of vanity metric, I always like this idea of like a vanity metric is a number that can only ever go up, right? So the number of users in our database can only ever go up. So we're like, whoa, we grew this week. Well, hooray, you know. Of course that was going to happen. What's really important is the rate of our growth, and not just the rate of growth of a vanity metric, but a real unit of value for our business. And the growth strategy, which I'm going to come on to, is to build a growth machine so that we can get this repeatable, predictable growth. So this is about how can we get a team that whatever that team does, you know, this concept of growth teams, their day-to-day work creates this machine that gives us confidence that our business is going to grow. Right? So from here, the next lessons lead into how we go about doing that. The next one, number 3, is to make sure we build a model to understand how our business actually works. So do we really understand how our business does grow? This is the concept here. If we don't understand how our business grows, there's a lot of things we can do. We could be pushing in all directions, launching marketing campaigns, but if we've no idea what we're doing, the classic startup, early stage company phenomenon is pushing in a lot of directions, spinning our wheels, working really hard, and sort of and all those efforts somehow don't end up in what we're hoping to achieve. So how do we go about this? And you know, I apologize in advance. It may not be the most riveting concept, but what I have used for this with companies at 500 and all the people I've met in the Valley talk about is the venerable spreadsheet. So essentially, it's this idea of modeling out in a very simple way, and you can use Google Docs or Excel, nothing complicated, a model for how our business grows. I've actually got a template here that I've used with many companies at this link, bit.ly/KPI-sheet, which you can use if you find it useful. But the idea is very simple. That there's a key thing here, that this is a model of growth. It's not a model of our operations. So the thing that goes atop is our key growth metric. So at the end of the day, it's going to be profit one day, hopefully. Below that comes revenue, right? So profit being, you know, revenue versus costs. Below that is our key growth or traction metric, our key growth or traction KPI. So this example on the screen here is for a subscription business. The key traction KPI is how many active subscribers do we have right now? So the question here for you is, for your business, what is your top level traction KPI to be thinking about? And this is the metric that, at the end of the day, if it's not growing, there's only so long we can go, whilst if it's not growing, we're kidding ourselves that we're making progress. And typically this is pretty simple. Number of active subscribers for a subscription business, number of transactions per week or month for an e-commerce site or for a marketplace. And then below that, we sort of fill out with everything that, from a growth perspective, leads up into driving, what are the component parts that will spit out that traction KPI. So that could be our entire funnel. For a subscription business, we've got new subscribers versus churn, for example. And then leading up into revenue, we've got upsells versus downgrades. On our acquisition funnel, we've got the whole funnel from new visitors, conversion rates, sign-up, trial, etc. So to recap, it's not an operational dashboard. We'll have separately operational dashboards for things like our campaigns, our day-to-day, which particular ad campaigns are working or which aren't. There's operations to do with just providing our business functionality, whether that's our e-commerce shipments or times or the service we may be providing. But this is about focusing entirely on what drives the growth of our top-level KPI. So once we've done that, and we have our growth model, the next thing to do is to start thinking towards what are we actually going to work on. And to do this, growth teams, instead of going off and thinking, okay, what's the latest, coolest hack out there, they start by looking at that model and identifying what are the levers that they can push on to get growth, and prioritize the backlog of growth ideas. So this is, whether we're thinking about marketing, we start to operate in a way that resembles how many engineering teams work, where you actually have a backlog of things that you need to do, and we need to prioritize them and maybe choose some of them we're going to do, some of them we're not. So what do I mean by levers? Are things we can push to get growth. So this is at a high level. If we think about our funnel, to get more growth, for an e-commerce business, we can get more first-time customers to buy from us for the first time, or we could encourage more people who've bought before to come back and buy again, right? So there's two different levers we could push on. If we drilled for a subscription business, we could sign up new people to our service, or we could reduce the rate at which people are churning out, right? Those are both two levers we could get to increase our growth. Taking either of those examples, for a transactional business, two levers we have are increasing supply and increasing demand. And the reason to sort of call these out is like at different times of the business, we may want to decide to focus on one versus the other at the time. And then another way of dividing it down is to think about the whole funnel. So, okay, say for an e-commerce business, we want to get more first-time customers. Should we focus on driving more traffic to the site, or should we focus on converting more people, converting more people to add to cart, or converting more people who add to cart to actually check out? And we can only prioritize this if we have that model that shows us what our current status quo is, like how is our business performing across all of these things, so that we can just decide what makes sense for our business, like what is our priority right now. And we can do that by prioritizing based on how we currently performing versus where do we think we could get to if we made certain changes. So that's so a key thing is to identify and drill down into focus. A technique for that, you may have encountered this term, your one metric that matters. This is the idea of saying, okay, think back to that spreadsheet and it's got multiple lines on it. Right? If we just look at that spreadsheet every week or every month, it would be very easy to try, again, I mentioned, fall into that trap of pushing in all directions. The one metric that matters is a useful technique to sort of focus a whole team, or as you grow the company, it could be focus an individual team, each team may have their own one metric that matters, to say, right now, we're going to just focus on this metric and say, what can we do to maybe grow the amount of traffic we have or improve our conversion rate. And then we can go to our backlog and say, here are all ideas for improving our conversion rate. And then we can sort of prioritize those. So typically growth teams work in this focus way where they dive in and say, right, this is our sort of goal for the next sprint or the next month or even the next quarter. and take that, and then, so use the model to zoom out, figure out what the appropriate goal is right now, and then zoom in, prioritize the backlog, work on those ideas, and then zoom out and say, going back to that model, where did we think we could get to in the spreadsheet? Where are our numbers currently? And are we going to keep working on the same one metric that matters, or is it time for our one metric that matters right now to change? Maybe we improved our conversion rate and now it's time to focus on driving more traffic, for example. So again, when we start to zoom in even more, and we've got our model, we understand how our business grows, we've chosen, identified our levers that we can push to get growth, we've prioritized which lever we're going to focus, we've identified the one metric that matters. The next thing is to prioritize all of our different ideas. A framework that's very common amongst growth teams is this ICE framework. There's lots of different ways of implementing it, but the key idea is just thinking about everything in terms of these three criteria: impact, chance of success, and effort. So for any idea, if it's an idea for how we could reach more customers and drive more traffic to our site, for example, or to download our app, we could say, well, what's the impact of this idea? So say it's, well, we should really start running Google AdWords. The impact should be a number, right? So let's say if we started running Google Ads, how many people would we reach? And how many of them do we think would end up downloading our app or ending up on our site? A specific number. Maybe we're already up and running with advertising, for example, but we think, oh, if we applied this strategy, so maybe we tried doing adverts around a certain type of messaging. So it could be really detailed. Like someone comes with this idea, we should do an advertising campaign around a certain message. So get a number for that. The second, the chance of success. People do this in different ways. Sometimes people do it on like 1 to 10. I like not overthinking it too much and just saying, is it a 20%, a 50%, or an 80% likelihood? So the point is here that we're never 100% sure. We may think it's a pretty safe bet. It's a very common technique, like running Google Ads. Maybe there's other businesses out there in a similar market to us that are using this technique successfully. And we can say this is an 80% chance of success idea. Maybe it's a long shot. This is some crazy new idea that we want to try, in which case it's a 20% chance of success. And then finally, the effort is just, how long would it take to try this? What the time and the resources. And so by ranking each idea we have for growth, be it a marketing idea, a product improvement, a sign-up process improvement, whatever it is, we can score all of ideas on these criteria and come up with a way of deciding what should we prioritize, what should we rule out, and what should we do next. Some people do this by ranking them all on like 1 to 10, adding all the numbers together, and then literally reading out which number is highest. When I've worked on teams with this, I found that is less fulfilling, often a little frustrating, in that it's often useful to take this as a guide, but then still have our gut feel to sort of have this to prompt the thought process, but then ultimately make a sort of gut plus numbers informed decision about what we actually want to work on. But the key point is it's whatever technique I would suggest works for you. The key point is to make sure we've considered these things before rushing in with our latest, greatest idea. Cool. So, number 5 out of 7 on the growth learnings the growth lessons, is to drive growth through experimentation and learnings. And here I sort of alluded to with the chance of success point in the last section, but this is the idea that we never quite know for sure what's going to work and what isn't. So you may be familiar with Eric Ries from the Lean Startup and his quote that learning is the essential unit of progress for startups. What he's getting at is the fact that everyone's context is different, and this idea that what worked for others may not work for us. And so this is a key part of growth teams. We're sort of really focusing in now on what the core of working in a growth team is all about. It's an experiment-driven process. So every week, the focus is around picking the latest idea, the top-rated idea off the backlog, and treating it as an experiment, saying this idea is a hypothesis. We can drive growth through this ad campaign, or through this change to our sign-up flow, or through tweaking this feature, whatever it may be. Now we're going to try it, and the thing about doing an experiment is, what do we do when something's an experiment? We call out what we're actually trying to experiment on, we call out what we believe will happen, and we measure the results of it. So this experiment-driven operation looks very much like a normal, you might expect from a marketing team or a product or an engineering team of implementing things, but every single thing is treated as not taken for granted, but is tested and measured. And so the idea being that it feeds back into learnings about what works and what doesn't. And a key thing that I love about this is to remember to always make predictions in advance. So I don't know about you, but for me personally, it's very easy to just implement something, put it out there, get a bunch of traffic, a bunch of users to encounter it, and then measure the result, and then be like, that worked, cool, okay, that didn't work, all right, on to the next thing, we'll incorporate those learnings, right? But for me, if I make a prediction in advance and I force myself to write down specifically this ad campaign, how many users will land on that web page, right? This conversion optimization, if we change the messaging on the page, if we add some social proof, right? If we remove some elements to simplify it, will it change the conversion rate from 10% to 15% or from 10% to 30%? What is my prediction here? And so a key thing is, if we're not making predictions, how can we prioritize, right? Because we need to work out exactly what the impact we believe is going to happen so that we know what to work on in what order. But not just that, I find that then when I've forced myself to write down what I expect to happen, that when I find out what actually happens, I'm like, wow, the learnings are much reinforced much stronger, that I'm actually shown publicly to the rest of the team, if I was wrong and I expected something to have a big impact and it had no impact whatsoever. So this is something I definitely encourage, and can be super fun. Not everyone on the team has to agree, right? You can actually get everyone to go around and sort of, hidden, everyone writes down secretly what they think the impact's going to be, how many people are going to land on the page, how many more people are going to convert, and then compare and contrast, and then feed that back into the prioritization process. But this sort of reinforcement learning through prediction, incredibly powerful. So drawing to a close, really, a key thing here is that for growth, it's around the mindset. And so if we take everything that I've shared so far, it's about thinking about a few things in that context. One is the world is constantly changing, and what you'll read on the blogs, what worked last year, last month, what worked for other companies, may not work today. The efficiencies of marketing channels changes as they become saturated, as other companies, as competitors sort of double down on them. It used to be a lot cheaper to acquire users through Google and Facebook, for example. There's this mindset of experimentation and learnings that we've talked through. This idea of building a machine. So every week we have the cycle of everything we've talked through, get the prioritized backlog, figure out which levers we want to focus on, implement the experiments, measure the results, and just keep churning. So it's less about this sort of Hail Mary efforts to get the latest growth hack and hope that it's going to solve our problems. And then finally, this mindset of being naturally curious and of trying things to see if they work. And actually remembering that we're motivated by helping the customers achieve their goals as well. And so to pull this all together is to maintain discipline with a weekly growth meeting. So this is how growth teams are operated. A weekly meeting, so set that cadence, which is the thing that makes the team work like a machine, with a very simple agenda. Every week, we review the KPIs in that growth model, that spreadsheet, very quickly. We go around and we focus, not did we do, but what did we learn last week, right? What did we learn from the results of our experiments? I was working through this with a company last year, and it was interesting, people getting their heads around the difference between what did we learn about what we can implement versus what did we learn about how we can grow. Because we'll learn a lot about what tools work, and we'll learn a lot about how to implement certain things. We'll learn to be better at implementing marketing campaigns and building features. But those are different learnings to growth learnings. Growth learnings are what worked for the customer. Did we improve conversion rate? Did we reach more people? And then finally, that process on the weekly cycle of planning, what experiments are we running this week? A key thing for this is no work's to be done during the meeting, right? This is a forcing function that causes us to zoom out from the day-to-day. And essentially review all of the content that I've shared in the 7 lessons up to date, and just make sure all be on one page. So people come to this meeting with the notes of the meeting already written in many cases. This is what we learned last week, here's the document. Here's what we're running this week, here's the plan. So this could be a very short meeting, half an hour a week, and the focus of it is on the interesting discussions about what we learnt, the good stuff that's going to help us be creative and focus about what things we should be doing in order to grow. And finally, actually, so a bonus one, talk to your users. Something that so many teams I've worked with, it's easy to forget, or easy to appreciate. Typically, I think I've yet to encounter a team that says, oh yeah, talking to users isn't important. You know, we all appreciate it's important. If you ask yourselves, when's the last time you actually did some customer development or some user testing or some user research? For the majority of teams out there, and other people have done testing on this, it's kind of like only about 1 or 2% of people are actually talking to users in a qualitative way every week, which is crazy. So this matters because it helps us always influence and ground us with back to what are we actually trying to do. We're trying to help people solve problems that they have through the solution that we're providing. And what messaging do we need for that? What things should we be working on to help them be more successful at that? For me, this user testing, it's one of those things, so we all appreciate it, but why don't we do it? It's often hard just to start. One encouraging thing I'd share is it's really more of a, it's something that you just learn by doing. So I'd encourage you to just try and make a habit, as we did at 500 Startups with our teams, of just getting to do, the teams do at least one user test, UX experiment, or customer interview every week, and not worry about making it perfect. And an easy way to get started, Steve Krug, who was the author of a couple of books, including like Don't Make Me Think, you may have encountered, has actually published this user testing script, which if you haven't done a user test recently, makes it super simple. It literally shows you what to say to your user. So it's an easy way to get started. So if you haven't done a user test recently, hopefully that's of value to you. Cool, so there's a lot in there. I'm going to pull it all together, and I'm basically done, but with some further reading if you're interested. A couple of books that I recommend, both of which have very growth hackery type of messaging around them, or how any startup can achieve explosive customer growth. But there's great content here. Growth Hacker Marketing is a really short read, actually, particularly if you're coming from the marketing side. It talks through the concept of how marketing from a growth perspective differs from more traditional marketing in a really simple and easy to digest way in a pretty short read. So very recommended there. And then particularly if you're in the earliest stages of building your company, Traction is a great book that talks through, for that stage of company, how to experiment with, they go through 19 different ways of, 19 different channels for acquiring users, and talk through how to go about testing each of these in that hunt for which one growth channel or 1 or 2 growth channels could be the one for your business. So two great resources there. Some people to follow, people who publish a lot of great content. Brian Balfour, who runs the Reforged Growth course, which is a course I took last summer actually for growth practitioners out in San Francisco. He blogs at coelevate.com. Incredible content about building growth teams, etc. Andrew Chen has been blogging for years. He's currently head of, I think it's rider growth at Uber. He's got a wealth of incredible content. Sarah Tavel is now a VC at Greylock Partners out in the Valley, but used to work on product at Pinterest. She's got some incredible writing on Medium, thinking about more from the product side of things, how to think about product from a growth perspective, around engagement and delivering value to people. And Casey Winters, who's also at Greylock, working in residence with their portfolio, has been publishing some great content recently. around, for example, one of his recent posts is around the role of a startup CMO, and some other stuff around building growth teams and various tactics. So some great people to watch. Check out all the stuff they published. And then finally, in the slides, which I will tweet out a link to afterwards, some further references here, the worksheets, a video that Brian gave about how to design and track experiments. So I hope that's been useful to you. Takeaways. What are people's takeaways? Over to you. What stuck out to you? What can you remember? Quick fire rounds, come on. Yes? Growth inbuilt in the product, not something that's tacked on as a gimmick afterwards. Yes, fantastic. What else? Choose one metric to focus on at any given time. Yes, indeed. What else? It's a mindset. Yes. The mindset of being growth. Yes. Make predictions. Fantastic. I love making predictions, especially when I'm proven wrong. What else? Talk to your users. Thank you. What else? Growth after product market fit. Otherwise, you're polishing a turd with your leaky bucket, whatever metaphors you want to mix in there. What else? Have we got them all? Value proposition and messaging. Everyone's, you're probably here thinking you've got that, but I'd encourage you to take that 10 minutes and just try 1 minute per question. Build a model. No one remembered the spreadsheet. Why did no one remember the spreadsheet? Oh dear. It's super key. Prioritization, yes. I think we got everything else. Focus on experimentation and learnings. Yes, great. Cool. Thank you very much. I hope this has been useful. Best of luck to you. And I think if we've got any questions, I'm glad to stick around. So thanks for coming.
So I wondered, as I'm building an app, if there are specific things for apps. Like I've looked at things like, I know that reviews are really important. So instead of just allowing users to just directly go to reviews, you do a channel saying, did you like it, didn't you like it, and you send them to feedback if they didn't like it, and ideas beyond ASO that you can do to really make your app grow.
Yeah, great. Yes, of course, ASO reviews are really important. But those are probably examples, so to give context to this, those are probably examples of things that once you're up and running, you're kind of optimizing. So you imagine you're in a place with your app where you already have a lot of people, hearing about you, coming to your app store, and then when they're in the app store, they're reading your description, looking at your pictures, maybe playing your video, looking at what your rating is and your reviews. So those two ideas are thinking around conversion rate once people have reached that app store, so actually downloading that app. There's any number of things you could be working on. And the majority, I would suggest, of the most important things apply whether it's an app or whether it's a website or whether it's any product. So in the beginning in particular, you're thinking about how you can reach people in the first place before they even get you to App Store, which reaching people, there are some techniques that are applicable to apps like native in-app advertising. Right, in other apps, advertising within the Facebook native app with login with Facebook. Oftentimes the typical benchmark I've seen is kind of like you lose about maybe 5% of people who download your app never actually get around to opening it. In between that minute or two it took to download, then they got distracted, their bus reached its stop, their friend said something. You add login up front, you lose another 10% of people. So app-specific stuff around, do you do it there? Do you sort of put value up front and then have user account creation later? So there is a lot of that sort of product stuff. I would just, and again, this in general applies whether it's app or not, I'd make plan out your whole funnel, get that growth model even before you're up and running. How can I grow? And so it's reaching new people. This is joining together the classic marketing stuff with the product stuff. So marketing is like awareness, appreciation, consideration, decision, trial, purchase, whatever it is. And then the product stuff, which is once you've got traffic, conversion rate, onboarding, user experience, etc., all coming together under growth and thinking, where are your biggest challenges you think they're going to be? Is it that, your biggest challenge will be finding people at all? And you're pretty confident that if you find them and if they get to the App Store, then a good percentage of them will download. And the fact that it was that the power of the word of mouth like sitting under the sort of heading of virality, I just didn't expect. And so for me, one of the big takeaways, there's sort of two facets recapping what's the two new ways of growing companies. One with this performance marketing, measurable, data-driven. We know for every individual visitor where they're coming from, did they convert, how much did it cost to acquire them. The other one being the product-driven growth. So one key thing under the product-driven growth is if someone's using your product or service, great, okay, well, we're going to work on conversion optimization. So we've got a page, we're going to change that page or the screen in our app and try and get more people to reach the next step. And so if you start from there, you start coming up with ideas like changing the color or changing the text or adding some social proof or removing some confusing elements or changing the design, right? And so these are the things that you try. And typically a lot of those things don't have a big effect or don't have an effect at all. And the reason for this is because, when the user is on that particular page or on that screen of the app, that's only one point in an entire experience they're having. When they first heard about our product or service, the impression they formed of it, their experience of downloading it and using it. And so just changing some wording on one page, they're probably not even going to read that wording regardless. And so oftentimes people start, when they're starting a growth team, start by doing tests that sort of don't move the needle, don't have much of an effect. So to get around that, encouraging people to think big. And so there was back to that slide towards the beginning, how to reach huge new throw ideas into a backlog. So frictionless is it doesn't necessarily have to be a fully fledged idea. One thing that a few teams I've worked with did that was pretty cool is they had their backlog prioritization, but they had a separate meeting which was around fleshing out ideas where on a Friday afternoon they would just get together every couple of weeks and look at a Trello board or an Asana or anywhere where people just thrown random ideas and be like, what, this one sentence idea, whose idea was this? It was Andy's idea. Andy, what the hell were you talking about? And just brainstorm and riff with the team, so that can be pretty fun. Also, as I just mentioned, so many ideas come from user testing and often the biggest and the best ones. For a magazine, this leads me into thinking about, ideas for what? And so that idea about having your one metric that matters. What is your goal? Have you decided what are you trying to achieve this week or this month? Is it about getting wider readership? Is it about getting more engagement with your current readership? Is it about getting people to come back more frequently, even if they are a loyal reader, for example? Is it about getting paid subscriptions or whatever? But typically it might be all of these things. But if you narrow it down and say, right, what's most important to us right now, and that gives you the focus for the ideas. So I think those three ways of can be really, really, really useful. And I did all this, and I made the big mistake of being too far removed from the individual humans who were going through the process. So you mentioned that you feel comfortable right now in the early stage. What I would say is don't let go of that and think that you've graduated beyond that stage. This point about even at scale doing that qualitative user testing to sort of keep you grounded in who are the people that you're trying to help out.
Andy, but that was an incredible output of sheer volume of thoughts for us to all aspire to work on, and I think most of us feel like if we even do a third of those in the next year, that would be off the charts. So Andy, thank you very, very much.
Thanks everyone for coming.